I'm Aberdeen Features lead Ryan Duff, and joining me this week is a whole panel of people that you'll be introduced to in just a second, because I've been off in Remscheid, Germany, for the Future Cleantech Architects Future Cleantech Festival, and we launched their latest report on baseload power. It was very interesting, so I'm not going to keep you any longer. I'll join you after the panel's done. I think to start with, despite saying we're not going to do a call and response, I'm going to start with you, Karan. I'm going to ask you a question. What was your key takeaway from those two presentations? I think you are maybe speaking to the end of the mic.
So for me, I think the report really talks about reaching to a 100% clean grid, and there are two parts to that answer. I think the first reaching the first 90%, there is high level certainty. You build solar, you build wind, you build transmission, you build storage right now, and nobody who's building these things right now in 2 or 3 years will say I should not have built that. And the cost of these technologies is low. That being said, we also need to look on the demand side a little bit. We need to see how we can charge EVs flexibly. We went to start work today. We saw that a little bit. Need that a lot more. We also need to have a little bit more creativity, a little bit more sociologists working on certain demand side solutions. But once we have built all of these things to the maximum, we're still left with the last 10%, and this is what the report really goes into. And the situation we have right now is that we don't have that much information on some of these technologies. So what this report does really well is that it highlights some of the trade-offs between these things. And for example, I really like the use of operational hours and how that affects the competitiveness of certain technologies. So the strategies, the trade-offs with some of these strategies is very important to highlight. And for me, that is the key takeaway.
Yeah, sorry, I was getting some word from our AV team during that answer there. So, yeah, Phil, same question to yourself. What's your key takeaways from those presentations?
I mean, I have to say what an amazing report it was, and really good information from Project Tempo. It was really enlightening to see how the public think about the challenges with the energy system and decarbonisation, and how climate change is now moved slightly down the agenda. And you highlighted the point going to energy security, which is increasingly up the agenda. And I think for Europe, we need to move away from being reliant on imports, and that includes fossil fuels. And so this report highlights one of the key ways that we can become self-sufficient as a region. And all I'll say is that the technologies, the geothermal and the nuclear. Sorry, can I stop? I think for the 3 year. That's very different. The nuclear, they need the support to develop. So these technologies aren't available today. They need the support to really bring them up. Geothermal, for example, needs to bring down the cost of geothermal. We need lots of drilling rigs across Europe. The US, because of the shale revolution, has lots of drilling rigs. Those aren't available in Europe. We need that investment to bring in those drilling rigs to really bring down the cost of these technologies.
I've also just been told by our AV team that we need to pass this microphone around, because this is broadcasting to the live stream better than the other two. So that whole open, long-form conversation where everyone's jumping in might be a little bit more difficult, but we'll get through it together. So, other than the fact that, Antoine, when I heard you presenting, I realised, possibly in the most embarrassing place, that I've been pronouncing Dankenflout wrong for years. I really found the takeaways interesting. But in the report itself, we spoke about, it speaks specifically around policy drivers, which obviously will lead into Maria as well. But we spoke about the idea of using nuclear and geothermal and hydroelectric in a different way to maybe is traditionally thought of. Now, when you're telling a nuclear developer that's used to emitting the same sort of baseload power as it's traditionally thought of, how do you then tell the developer, well, you kind of need to fluctuate to meet sort of changes in demand? Ask everyone to hand this down the line.
No, indeed, that's sort of a tough sell, certainly at face value for a developer and for sort of conventional plants. I would say in some countries it's already sort of being done, like France, because the nuclear fleet is already so large, some of the balancing is done with hydro historically, but also they do flex their plants, but the problem is they flex downwards. There's only sort of one direction, and it's not great for the economic viability of the plants. Not so much on the technology side, it's sort of doable. But yes, these technologies, they're very CapEx heavy. So you want to maximize selling as much energy as you can over their lifetime to make as much revenue to pay back that CapEx. But the thing is, I don't see much point in nuclear sort of maximizing its capacity factor if it's also selling that electricity during periods of the day when solar is super abundant and prices are negative. That's also eroding its business case. To keep the reactor bit at baseload, that's good for your capex. And if you flex the steam side, then you can have power generation going up and down, not 100% to 0 and to 200%. But if you can already flex even a little bit, even plus or minus 10%, that's valuable for the energy system. And I just want to sort of give a shout out to my colleague, Dr. James Lazenby, who wrote an award-winning paper on this actually 2 years ago, looking at how integrating thermal storage within a nuclear power plant, a conventional plant, you can actually flex more or less 10%, including upwards. And so this is one of the bits of the report that if you can do that, if you can avoid selling your electricity when the price is 0 or close to 0, and instead sell that same electricity later thanks to this integrated storage when the prices are much higher, then that should be better for the economics of the nuclear plant as well. But it is sort of a change from baseload operation. If you really want to operate baseload, you can also, another alternative is to find a client who wants baseload. And that sort of ties into what you were saying earlier about data centers. And those customers really want reliable 24/7 power, and they're big enough and have deep enough pockets to pay for this kind of plant potentially. So that's the alternative.
So first of all, okay, maybe this is better. I would first of all comment on the geothermal part. Geothermal has been operating for a while, but the bad thing has been that it's been concentrated in some regions near the load. But I am really excited to see personally about the potential applications of this enhanced geothermal that we are hearing more and more about. And if you look at some of these DOE, erstwhile DOE Earthshot program, the cost reductions they target there, you can have a fundamentally different role of geothermal in your energy system, not just on the supply side also. Like, yes, you can generate electricity, but also on the demand side with heat pumps. So that being said, coming back to the point about nuclear, one of the things that we need to understand about nuclear is that the age of the current reactor fleet is now quite old. It's about 33 years. And it can be, they are nearing their age, and operating them, extending their lifetime is a little bit dangerous. It can be a little bit dangerous. And we need to be able to sustain the generation they have been giving for the last 30 years, which has not changed much. We need to build a lot of new reactors, which we have not been able to do in a timely or a cost-effective manner. So a lot of these strategies, I'm very interested to read a little bit more about these strategies to make nuclear a little bit more viable, because the only reason that nuclear gets built is because the state takes all the risks. They provide concessional finance, below the market rates, a lot of supply chain support, technical support, personal support, and the private sector just doesn't take the risk. So it would be very interesting to see that happen. In other words, if I put this, there wouldn't be any nuclear reactor if the state doesn't take all the risks. And it has been happening, like nuclear is having a moment right now, again. And the poster child are small modular reactors. I have my reservations because if you consider a very strict definition of small modular reactors that are smaller than 300 megawatts, they are factory built, assembled at site. There are none that are operating today. There are just couple from last I read, which are just small. So it would be interesting to see how that scales up. The history of nuclear reactors has been that the most promising designs were small. Like they were initially built small, and the most promising designs were scaled up to take economies of scale, the advantages that come with it. And if you scale them back down, some of the costs don't reduce in the same factor. The construction costs, the licensing costs, they don't reduce by a factor of 4 if you reduce the scale of the reactors by 4. That being said, to me, it doesn't feel like small modular reactors, if they are built in the strictest of definition, can compete even with conventional nuclear, especially if you take advantage of these innovative business models, let alone with renewable. So it's a very difficult case, and I think a lot of pragmatism about nuclear comes from understanding the fact that they're only going to play a niche role in some remote, especially small reactors, in a niche role in some military applications or in a remote mining site, as they have been doing right now.
You know what? Just thinking there, your point around sort of government buy-in and government support for nuclear, that makes me think I want to come to you next, Maria, because in the same way that as a company, it needs to have its shareholders backing investments and its investors agreeing with investment, for a government to get behind the technology, it really needs voters on side. And I'm seeing a little bit of similarities between Germany and Scotland in terms of political consensus around nuclear. The SNP, the government in Scotland, aren't overtly happy with nuclear, although some polling have suggested that their voters are more keen on it than they are. Here, it seems like there's a bit of a pushback against nuclear. When you were gathering your data, how much input did you need to give the average person about what an SMR is, what's the difference between fission and fusion, and does that make a difference? I'm going to pass this mic all the way down now.
Yes, that's actually an excellent question, because what we did before that survey that I showed were focus groups, so where we actually got together with a group of people and really were able to ask follow-up questions and let them discuss different technologies. So that was a much better setting to really understand if people understand the technology. And indeed, there's a lot of confusion, especially around nuclear, and especially around nuclear fission and fusion. And I think on the data you saw, or I found really interesting that the data, when we then did the poll, where we didn't provide an explanation, because, as a, I don't know, in a newspaper or as a politician, you're also not always able to make a long explanation. So it's often just, when people are confronted with a technology, what's their intuition, even if they don't completely understand what it is? Because we also need to live with that uncertainty. And what I found really telling is that the data for nuclear fusion and fission was almost exactly the same in Germany. Same party divides. And I think for the German government now, that's really Germany specific, but the German government is really betting on fusion at the moment in Germany, and I think for some good reasons, because there are some promising startups. So the government, or also all political parties, even the Greens, are not against fusion. They see that as a promising technology. But I think our data is a little bit of an early warning signal for fusion, that you really need to explain that technology, because otherwise people will confuse it with fission, even though it's different. So it's important, you know, to look at it and to understand that early on, because otherwise you will have the same conflict lines as for fission.
I'd just like to come back to you on that, the Scotland point. I used to work for the UK Civil Service, and in that there was they were much more proponents of nuclear, and all the modelling we've seen showed that nuclear and SMRs had a vital role in bringing down the cost of energy for the UK. So, while Scotland isn't necessarily pro-nuclear, the UK are building 2 expensive reactors, I should say, but we're hoping that SMRs and fusion are going to play a very important role in the future energy system.
Of course, yeah, we've got Sizewell C, which, as you say, is very expensive and going slightly over budget. Slightly is maybe a generous way of putting it. But then we've also got Wilfa, the small modular reactor that's going ahead in Wales as well. I was mainly bringing up Scotland for the comparisons with political consensus, but you're right to call that out, Phil. Do you know what? We'll stick with you, actually, because I want to pivot to a different technology that's maybe wasn't mentioned in Antoine's presentation too heavily, but it was mentioned in the report itself, because you were wanting to speak about CCS before we started as well, because you've got a background in the US and you've maybe come to a slightly different conclusion to the report.
Yeah, the US is a very different situation politically as well as economically and resources. So in the US, there is plentiful, they're one of the biggest gas producers in the world. So there's plentiful supplies of gas, and I think you showed a graphic of the cost of gas within the US earlier today, and the gas cost in the US is a fraction of what the gas cost is in Europe. So what we're finding with the hyperscalers, which are the companies building or proposing to build all the data centers that we need for the build out of AI, is they are going down the gas route, and they are going down with gas plus CCS. And so I think whilst for Europe it may be a different story, gas plus CCS is a really important part of the clean firm agenda and clean firm conversation.
Yes, I'd love to give a bit more detail maybe on our sort of viewpoint on gas plus CCS in the report. And there's sort of a couple of different reasons that sort of made us very hesitant and kind of downgrade it in what we think it should play a role, certainly in Europe. So number one, concerns around the climate integrity of gas plus CCS, because I mean, it's only as green as 2 assumptions. Number one, very high capture rates, and which is not necessarily trivial, achieving that. And number 2, low upstream emissions, which is not addressed by the CCS part. And this is sort of a chronic problem with the natural gas industry. Leaks upstream in the extraction, and natural gas has a very high global warming potential, so any leaks are sort of very, very detrimental very quickly to the climate case. Number 2, energy security, I think doesn't need to sort of be sort of detailed too much. Certainly in Europe's situation, obviously in the US it's different because there's a lot more home extracted gas. And on the cost side, sort of 2 things. We see natural gas plus CCS as, unlike some of the other technologies, there's really sort of no perspective of cost reduction or learning curves. Sort of structurally, by definition, natural gas plus CCS is more expensive than natural gas. And unless you have, obviously, carbon pricing, but carbon pricing is very much sort of a strong policy tool, and as we've seen with recent changes in administration, you can't always count on policy continuity. So there's that. And then also, if you're locking in continued natural gas use, it does I fear it will interplay with other parts of gas in our energy system. And if we're getting rid of natural gas in industrial heat, in buildings and homes, etc., the small costs that we took for granted for natural gas, I think will become much larger. So like networks, all those pipelines, yes, we've already built them, but if suddenly the user base that's using them becomes much, much smaller, then it becomes disproportionately more expensive to maintain those pipelines and that network. So that's why we were sort of quite skeptical in the end, and certainly for Europe. Obviously, the US is a very different situation. And finally, also, again, the focus of the report was very much for the EU, but at Future Cleantech Architects, we sort of are keen for Europe to develop clean technologies, but not just for Europe, but to develop technologies in Europe that will spill over and scale globally. Otherwise, I mean, yes, it's good to decarbonize Europe, but the impact is much lower. CCS, gas plus CCS, again, coming back to this policy thing of needing carbon pricing, we don't see that as very scalable on a global level, convincing every single country or more countries to back this.
Can I add to that skepticism? Yeah. So one of the arguments that is used for fossil plus CCS is that it is, even if you remove the carbon price, it's that on the cost basis, they say that you have to include the cost of system services to a solar plant and a wind plant. And by that logic, a gas plus CCS project is cheaper and it's clean. And because it provides system services, which your variable renewable don't, and you have to add the cost. And to that, I sometimes think they are not the best arguments, because it is, first of all, if you're not adding costs of system services to any other technology, it doesn't make sense to add it to a particular renewable technology, just because it's variable. And secondly, it's not the responsibility of a single generator to ensure that the system is stable. It is the property of a system to be stable. So you don't need, and that is sometimes the confusion that I sometimes read, that people read dispatchability and system reliability as use them interchangeably. But in fact, they're very different things. The goal for the consumers is to have a reliable grid which is operational in periods of high risk or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree on the upstream methane emissions, that they're essential to bring down as part of any gas system. I mean, that doesn't just rely on CCS and gas CCS. We should be targeting bringing down the upstream methane emissions across our methane demand. In Europe, we are going to be using natural gas probably into the 2050s, to some extent. So it's essential that we really bring down those upstream emissions, and that's something that isn't just linked to CCS. And I agree, we need high capture rates as well. In the US, it's a very different market than in Europe, and so it's, whilst I agree, it is going to make the power more expensive. We are seeing people investing in it, these hyperscalers investing in it today. Well, they're claiming to invest they're investing in the gas generation part, and they're claiming that they're CCS ready. So it's important that we hold them to that CCS part, because those gas generators are getting put in today.
I just wanted to make a point on regional differences, because we were talking about obvious differences between Europe and the US. But I think especially for clean from power, and that also became clear in your report, we should also allow for differences within Europe, because there are huge differences. Some technologies like, hydropower was also in your report, and then obviously geothermal, there are like differences in the geology where these projects can be built, of course. And I think we definitely need to allow for regional differences from that perspective, but also from a political perspective. Because, for nuclear, I think that's pretty obvious that there are, big differences between countries. We have France with a big nuclear fleet, we have other countries that phased out nuclear. And you made a really interesting point also on scaling up these technologies, especially on nuclear, that you actually need that you need them at scale, so it doesn't really make sense to build like single nuclear plants, if I understood you correctly. So we need to allow for regional differences, but we also need to see that there's enough, capacity or enough projects in like one region, or I don't know, if a couple of countries build a coalition and really scale one technology or one type of nuclear technology. I think that's also important to take into consideration.
Yeah, if I can just continue that point. Yes, scale is one of the big points in the report that we make. And this is for, honestly, like all the technologies and energy technology in general. If you want competitiveness and sort of cost reductions, then you need to produce that thing at scale. And this is true for nuclear, this is true for geothermal. For nuclear, you can sort of see this quite clearly in how back in the sort of 70s and 80s, countries like France or Sweden built whole fleets of nuclear reactors, and they did it much better than we're doing it today. So it's very weird to think, oh, we've regressed, we've gotten worse at building this stuff. But the difference is, sort of in France, for example, where I'm from, in the 1970s, there was the Plan Mesmer, which was a whole fleet, and they said, within this fleet, within this program, we're going to build the same reactor over and over again. No changes, and all of this within a relatively short time span. Today, the situation is the complete opposite, where you have the same countries, like the UK or France, who are building sort of one reactor every decade or so, and which is why, going back to the UK, when you mentioned it earlier, building plants, but building so few of them that there's really, they're not reaping the sort of the rewards that they're looking for. So it's kind of one of those technologies where I want to say go big or go home, and it's, if you don't want it at all, fine, but if you're going to do it, doing it in homeopathic doses that doesn't deliver much. So you really need to, and yeah, the same logic also applies to geothermal, especially given that we're at an earlier stage. It's much less mature technologically. Again, next generation geothermal, not conventional. So if you want to see any real progress, again, you need scale. You need to build many of these. You need to go from first of a kind to nth of a kind if you want to see real improvements. And I think we can. And kind of going back to what you were alluding to earlier, what we've seen so far in next generation geothermal, especially enhanced geothermal, and a lot of it in the US, unfortunately, hopefully some in Europe, is the learning rates have been very promising. So we need to keep moving forward, keep deploying them more, because R&D only takes you so far. You need to deploy in the real world, because that's where supply chains get built. That's where the real lessons are learned on the ground, and you get the cost reductions, which is exactly what happened with solar PV over the past 20 years with manufacturing in China. So.
And on that, sorry, you'll get your turn very soon. On that point, whilst probably a controversial subject, shale gas, they brought down the cost of shale gas, which has similar technologies to geothermal, by moving into the process into a manufacturing process where the rigs were used consistently. They were moving from site to site to site, and that really brought down the costs of shale gas, and also you could see it also working for geothermal as well.
I think we struck a nerve, and we were able to keep this conversation going, which is exactly what I asked for. However, we do now have quite a number of questions coming in online, and also I believe this gentleman in the corner here has been waiting patiently to ask a question. So, if you could, I don't think those microphones work.
Thanks. Georg Kopiela from Bellona, Germany. I was following the discussion around the fossil gas and CCS power plants, because as Bellona is kind of the NGO famous or infamous to bring CCS frequently in the debate. And we currently published the second version of our CCS letter and looked a bit in depth on these gas power plants and played around with various scenarios. It was a European perspective in the thing, so a US perspective might look differently. But basically, if you look at also kind of a development over a bit of a period of time, so that it doesn't just stick to right now, we basically didn't find a case where it made sense to use that case. Basically, if you either have them in a while in the future just for these seasonal bufferings or for some interim period within a day, you will always find something else you could rather do in a cheaper manner, because you just have to have a lot of infrastructure on these things. So might be different in different cases, and you might find a fringe case somewhere, but it's not going to run in Europe.
I'm going to say, does anyone want to respond to that? And I feel like the man sitting directly to my left will be the person that does.
When you say it's not going to run in Europe, do you mean for power or do you mean in general? So CCS for industry, decarbonisation, we see as essential as one of those routes for decarbonisation. So we work very closely with Bologna. So I guess I know the answers to that question.
I was specifically referring to fossil gas power plants. That's like there are a lot of other cases, and we looked through a lot of other cases, and it's a totally different thing, like for a cement plant or a waste incinerator and so on. Check out this ladder, like the CCS ladder 2.0. You'll find it when you just Google it, and a lot of other cases will definitely have a case.
You know, we've got a number of questions piling in from our online broadcast as well, so I'm going to try to get through as many as we can, although the conversation has gotten away from us a little bit. We only have about 3 minutes left, so if whoever you think is the best person to answer, raise your hand really quickly. It's first come, first serve. So I'm gonna go from Aaron on Riverside to start with, who said, what is the panelists' opinion on biogas and biomethane? Germany has one of the biggest fleets of biogas plants. Thanks. I believe that's Antoine, right?
I guess so, yeah. So we do discuss biogas briefly in the report. And here, well, it's actually kind of similar to the CCS discussion in terms of also the concept of this ladder. I think we need a biogas ladder as well, because biogas, so two things: limited supply, and it's a valuable molecule because it's the same thing as natural gas. It's methane, so you can use that. Well, given you have a limited supply, you should prioritize that for the sectors that have the fewest alternatives. So that could include making fuels for shipping and aviation. It could include biogas for covering Dunkelflaute with existing gas turbines. But yes, don't use it to heat your home. Don't blend it into the rest of the gas grid and kind of waste it there. The caveat I'll add to this, though, is biogas, from all my reading of the literature, I never get a clear answer on how green is it really? And this is really kind of a major sticking point for us, is the numbers are all over the place. Sometimes it's like, oh, it's actually carbon negative overall. Sometimes you see numbers where it's just as bad as natural gas because you get methane leakage in the production and things like that. So that's why I see a fairly niche role for it, and I don't want Europe to go down full steam ahead on relying on biogas and maybe making some kind of mistake where we rely on something that turns out in 20 years we'll have newspaper headlines saying, actually, this was really bad for the climate. Whereas the other technologies in the report, we can be more confident, certainly on the climate integrity.
Do you know, we still have lots of online questions as well, but I've realized that we're at 44 minutes, 16 minutes to, and we don't really have much time, so I know we've earmarked some time for yourself, Antoine, to wrap up. Would you still like to do that? Because we can keep going on with questions. It's up to yourself. More questions. Karan, did you want to jump in on that?
No, I agree with with what Antoine said, and I think a lot of uncertainty comes from the fact that
I think you're good.
yeah, that some estimates of emissions do not include indirect land use change, which can be huge. It can be worse than using gasoline. Yeah.
Do you know, I've got another question here. They're both from the same person, and they are kind of similar, so I'll try to wrap them together. But the first question was, as energy systems transition towards low-carbon technologies, how do you balance the need for reliable, clean energy with long-term risks to water resources, land, biodiversity, and local communities? Should environmental and water security be given equal priority alongside energy security? I feel like this might be a public question, so I might hand it over to Maria to start
Maybe
with.
for the next poll. No, actually, maybe I can advertise our next poll because I believe there are some questions on the environment in there and at European level. I can check whether there's one on water, but I personally totally agree that we should not neglect factors like that. I don't have the technical answer to that, but I do find it important also to look at that from a public perspective.
And we've got a question here on some wave and tidal from a Mona Rusman, who has asked, today's discussion focuses on energy abundance and resilient clean power systems. I've been exploring 2 surface water energy concepts published through Clean Innovation Wire. One based on wave-driven pumping, and another on reimagined river wheel hydropower. If experts believe that the ideas merit further investigation, what would be the best pathway to obtain technical feedback, mentorship, or collaboration for early-stage validation? Does anyone feel particularly confident in giving someone with an interesting new technology some advice?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. I used to work in innovation, so it's been a while. But speak to, I don't know where they're based, but speak to relevant authorities or have a look. I know what it's like in the UK, but I don't know what it's like in Europe. But there are organisations out there that will support you with developing your bid and developing your technology and giving you advice on that. There are accelerator programs out there, and they'll give you very good advice.
And congratulations to Mona Rusman, because I think that's the last question of the day, so they've wrapped up the panel session. I did have one extra question that I'm going to be really cheeky and fit in just now, but we are already over time. Now, we've discussed quite a lot of technologies, a lot of policy drivers throughout this conversation, but if there was one concrete thing that Europe could do right now to better its situation, what would it be? I'm going to start with Phil, we're going to end with Maria, and then that'll be us done. What was your question? So if there was one concrete thing Europe could do to drive innovation and change, what would it be?
I think it's actually target your innovation to the needs. Look where the innovation's needed. The Innovation Fund seems to be not as focused as it should be. That we've got past the point where we have to be neutral about all technologies. We need to now start looking at what the technologies we think are going to be successful and needed for the future of Europe. And that's where we should target the money. So that's things like industrial electrification, investment in industrial electrification, really trying to scale that technology so it's can meet the scale of the future.
I think dramatically scaling up, going bonkers on building solar, wind, storage, grids would be the best thing we could do right now.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. We're in the middle of an energy crisis, so Europe should be ambitious. The last time this happened in the 1970s, Europe rose to the challenge, and I think it should again today. If I can be if we want one more specific recommendation, concrete actionable at the European level, which is where Future Cleantech Architects is focused, we would like to see a dedicated geothermal action plan, because currently it's kind of there's support for it in Brussels, but it kind of floats around in different policy packages. It's in the heating and cooling plan, and over here and over there. And if we could just give it sort of its own due attention, because I think that would go much further. So.
Yes, my recommendation would be to be even more serious on energy security, because in many cases there's an overlap with climate technologies. And I will also echo your point on geothermal, because as we've seen in our data, I think there's also a public opening for geothermal. So I believe it's a good timing to really double down on geothermal specifically.
Sure, I can improv an outro to the whole event. Well, thank you very much for joining us. We are 5 minutes over, but I think considering everything we covered, we can be forgiven for that. So thank you for sticking around to the end of the festival. And I believe if this conversation has piqued your interest, if you've stayed around this long, I'm sure it has. Antoine's report can be found online as of now, right?
Everything's on our website.
Everything's on the website. Perfect. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and for everyone that was watching the live stream, thank you to you too. And that did it for this week's episode of Energy Voice Out Loud. Very different. I can't say next week is going to be quite the same, although we will be at our Women in New Energy event in Aberdeen if you fancy coming by and saying hello. Now, that does it for us this week. We'll join you same time, same place next week.